Operation Just Cause was launched by President Bush in 1989 against General Manuel Antonio Noriega of Panama. President Bush claimed he was defending the Treaty of Panama, Americans, and democracy, but there is little evidence to back up these claims. Bush had a history with Noriega and sought to retaliate as well as to establish a greater American dominance in Panama. The operation became one that would violate numerous treaties as well as decimate the civilians of Panama without much change to the state of the Panama Canal. General Noriega was picked by Panamanian legislature to be the leader of Panama in 1989. His leadership was a dictatorship backed up by the Panama Defense Forces. The reason that took off in the media was that Noriega was the supposed drug lord and dictator of Panama, and these drugs were smuggled into the U.S. The public rallied behind Noriega's new image of drug lord and began to support the war in Panama, but Bush's history with Noriega would deem this unreasonable. Before Bush was president, he served under President Jimmy Carter as director of the CIA and was very familiar with Noriega. Noriega was on the CIA payroll because he gave information about other drug lords in South America. Bush was well aware of Noriega's drug trafficking even before he was president and had supported Noriega regardless. For example, Noriega was taken off of the payroll when Reagan found out he was smuggling drugs, but Bush insisted upon putting him back on regardless of his illegal activities. Also, before Noriega was in charge of Panama, Omar Torrijos was dictator. The U.S. did not have a problem with his leadership because the U.S. was still in control of the Canal Zone. Noriega's rule as dictator isn't justification enough because the U.S. didn't mind Torrijos and also wasn't removing every other dictator in Central America at the time. Noriega was pinpointed for particular reasons besides his leadership. When Noriega came into control, he was still feeding the U.S. information, but he slowly started to pull away from the U.S. As he pulled away, Bush got frustrated with Noriega and began to label him as a dictator and drug trafficker to the American media, which in turn rallied the people to take him out of power. Since Noriega wasn't cooperating, Bush wanted someone new in control and sought after this goal by picking new Democratic leaders like Billy Ford to revolt against Noriega. The message sent to Noriega was to either accede to U.S. demands or step aside. The media had a large influence on the American public, and Bush knew this, so he exploited what he could. By labeling Noriega a dictator and drug trafficker, it caused tremendous support. After telling the American public that PDF forces were firing upon the Americans, that really fired up the public. Bush was fairly open with the public, and he held more press conferences than Reagan, Clinton, and his son. Historians Hertog and Rush stated, despite a large increase in the amount of coverage of this conflict in the news magazines, the range of debate about the invasion remained restricted within relatively narrow frame. After the stories were released, Americans weren't skeptical about the situation because only one side of the story was presented. The president was in control of the media and didn't even allow the media to get a different story. During the invasion, no cameras were allowed as the army would confiscate them and push a cameraman away, and even after, very few reporters were allowed in.
I had already taken photographs in the Chorillo area. I'd also taken photos of some dead bodies in the street. When a North American soldier told me I couldn't walk any further, they wanted to take my camera away, but I didn't let them. So they made me open the camera and expose the roll of film with the shots of the dead bodies I had taken.
When they were allowed in, they were restricted to areas that were under the control of the Americans. A year later, Bush further celebrated his success in his State of the Union address of 1990, saying, one year ago, the people of Panama lived in fear under the thumb of a dictator. Today, democracy is restored. Panama is free. Operation Just Cause has achieved its objectives. He boasted about its success when in actuality Panama was not in a state of democracy, but rather its people were furious with Americans, destroying their homes and placing a ruler they didn't want. The United Nations condemned the operation to be a violation of the UN Charter, and only few media sources spent time to mention it. Another claim by Bush was that he wanted to protect the integrity of the Panama Canal Treaty. The problem is that Bush did the exact opposite of protecting the treaty. In the Treaty of Panama, there's a 10-mile canal zone in which the U.S. can get involved with. When the operation was launched, though, Bush went outside these areas to attack PDF forces, even though he was going after Noriega himself. Also, Carter and Torrijos worked to improve the treaty in hopes of restoring the Panama Canal back to the Panamanians. With the new implications, American troops were to be out of Panama by 2000, and Panama was to be given full responsibility of the canal. Bush was evidently not going to let this happen because he wanted to destroy the Panamanian military. During the attack, he aimed to take out the PDF forces, which was Panama's main source of defense. By taking this force out with only 10 years until the Panamanians would have to defend themselves, this allowed for further American military intervention. As for the defense of Americans, Bush was defending few. In Panama, there were both civilians and military personnel who were American. PDF forces came into contact with many Americans and some skirmishes broke out. One quarrel consisted of the firing of a PDF weapon at a U.S. Marine Corps lieutenant, which Bush then used to fuel a fire. What is interesting about some of the fights that went on is that there was a Marine force called the Hard Chargers who often provoked many of the PDF forces into firing at them. Some witnesses even say that Americans were firing back in these situations. In defense of the Americans who were provoking PDF force attacks, the U.S. decimated the cities surrounding Panama. In Panama City, when a neighborhood next to the PDF main headquarters burned to the ground, up to 10,000 Panamanians were forced to flee their homes. This was not putting the country back together, but rather destroying one. And as Peter Cornbluth said, Americans were destroying a country to save it. The last reason Bush provided for the invasion was to defend democracy, which was the opposite of what he had done. During the presidential election in May 1989, the CIA spent at least $10 million in U.S. taxpayers' money to finance the campaign of Indira. The U.S. went ahead and used American money to fund this foreign campaign, which is actually illegal in the U.S. Our elections are not allowed to be influenced by foreign countries. With this money, of course, Indira had won, but it was deemed unfair, and the Panamanian National Assembly went ahead and appointed a president and vice president with Noriega as head of state. Instead of trying to form a new democracy in which the people of Panama could choose their leader, Americans chose people who were educated in America and would help to make America more powerful. After the invasion, President appointed by the Americans wanted to help renegotiate the treaty to allow for American military presence to last longer. Bush repeatedly said that the removal of Noriega would remove some drug trafficking into America, but the new president was also involved in trafficking. In the years after the invasion, drug trafficking increased to double what it had been before the operation. The new leader was a puppet of the Americans, in which they would be able to get what they want from Panama without resistance. Operation Just Cause was an operation launched to impose more military dominance over Panama and its canal. President Bush's justifications for the operation were cover-ups for an extensive past with dictator Manuel Noriega, as well as the want to continue America's control over the canal. The operation did not stop the drug trafficking or the instability in Panama, but rather increased it. In 2000, under President Clinton's watch, Panama gained its control of the canal, thus creating closure to Operation Just Cause and its injustice.